The searchlight cut through the darkness like the finger of God pointing at the damned. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Hartwell felt his blood freeze as that brilliant white beam swept across the black waters of what the Marines had started calling Iron Bottom Sound. The light caught USS Atlanta square amidships, turning her gray hull silver bright and every man on deck into a stark silhouette against the tropical night. For one terrible heartbeat, the entire task force was naked under that merciless illumination, whispered Seaman Rodriguez at the next gun mount. We're lit up like a Christmas tree. Tom's hands tightened on the bridge rail as he watched the searchlight source, a Japanese destroyer materializing out of the darkness less than 2,000 yards off their starboard bow. In the eerie glow, he could see the rising sun painted on her superstructure, could almost make out the faces of enemy sailors at their battle stations. They were so close he felt like he could throw a baseball and hit their bridge. All batteries, commence firing. Admiral Scott's voice crackled over the TBS radio, but Tom barely heard it over the thunderous roar that erupted from Atlanta's 5-inch guns. The night exploded. Orange flames bloomed from every gun mount along Atlanta's hull as her anti-aircraft batteries, designed to swat planes from the sky, trained their deadly attention on the enemy destroyer. The muzzle flashes strobed like lightning, turning the darkness into a hellish dance of light and shadow. Tom felt the deck plates vibrate beneath his feet with each salvo, the concussion wave from the guns hitting him in the chest like invisible fists. But the Japanese weren't going to die quietly. The enemy destroyer's main battery opened up with a flash that seemed to split the night in half. Tom watched, mesmerized, as the orange streaks of 5-inch shells screamed overhead, their passage marked by that distinctive whoosh-crack sound that every sailor learned to fear. Most flew high, but one struck Atlanta just after the number 3 turret, sending a geyser of sparks and twisted metal spinning into the air. Damage control to frame 120. Came the call over the ship's announcing system, but Tom barely heard it. His attention was fixed on the chaos unfolding around them as more Japanese ships materialized from the darkness like steel ghosts. This was supposed to be a simple mission. Admiral Scott's task Group 64, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers, had been sent to intercept what intelligence claimed was another Tokyo Express run, one of those fast destroyer missions the Japanese used to reinforce their troops on Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Simple, routine, even after 2 months of this grinding campaign. But nothing about tonight was routine. Torpedo wakes in the water. Came a shout from the port lookout. Bearing 270, multiple contacts. Tom's blood turned to ice water as he spotted the phosphorescent trail streaking toward them through the dark water. Long fins, white and deadly, cutting through the swells at 40 knots. He counted 5, wakes heading directly for Atlanta's port beam. All ahead flank. Left full rudder. Captain Jenkins' voice boomed across the bridge as Atlanta heeled hard to starboard, her screws churning the water to foam as she fought to avoid the spread of long-lance torpedoes. Tom grabbed for the nearest stanchion as the deck canted sharply, watching those deadly white wakes slice through the water where they'd been just seconds before. But even as Atlanta dodged the torpedoes, more enemy ships kept appearing. Japanese destroyers and cruisers seemed to materialize from every point of the compass, their guns already flashing as they opened fire on Scott's formation. The Americans had sailed into a trap, or maybe the Japanese had sailed into theirs. In the chaos and confusion of a night engagement, it was impossible to tell who was hunting whom. Surface contacts bearing 090, range 800 yards. Came another call from the radar operators. 800 yards. That was practically knife-fighting range for naval vessels. Tom could see the enemy ship clearly now, a heavy cruiser with pagoda masts that identified her as one of the newer Japanese designs. Her main battery was swinging toward them, those long 8-inch barrels tracking Atlanta like the eyes of a predator. The first salvo from the Japanese cruiser arrived with a sound like the world ending. The 8-inch shell screamed overhead with a freight train roar before impacting in towering waterspouts just off Atlanta's starboard quarter. The columns of seawater rose higher than the ship's masts before cascading back down, drenching the afterdeck with spray that tasted of cordite and death. Return fire. All batteries engage, Captain Jenkins ordered, and Atlanta's guns swung toward the new threat. But Tom knew they were outgunned. The light cruiser's 5-inch batteries packed a punch, but they were no match for the Japanese cruiser's 8-inch rifles in a slugging match. Around them, the entire American formation was dissolving into chaos. In the strobing light of muzzle flashes and searchlights, Tom caught glimpses of other ships, USS San Francisco engaging what looked like a Japanese battleship at point-blank range, destroyers weaving between the heavy units like water bugs in a pond, tracers flying in every direction like deadly fireworks. The sound was indescribable. The thunder of big guns mixed with the crack of smaller weapons, the whistle of incoming shells, the crash of impacts, and underneath it all, the steady throb of engines as ships maneuvered at flank speed in the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Tom felt like he was standing inside a thunderstorm made of steel and fire. Multiple surface contacts. Bearing 320. Came yet another report from the radar room. Range decreasing rapidly. Tom turned to see more enemy ships emerging from the darkness to port. A column of Japanese destroyers racing toward the American line at high speed, their bow waves white with phosphorescence. As he watched, the lead destroyer's torpedo tubes swung outboard, and he knew more long lances were about to join the deadly ballet playing out on the black water. This was it then. This was the moment every naval officer trained for but secretly hoped would never come. A night action at close quarters, where split-second decisions meant the difference between victory and death, where seamanship mattered as much as firepower, where luck could trump skill in the blink of an eye. Tom gripped the bridge rail tighter as Atlanta shuddered under another near miss from enemy shell fire. Around him, the bridge crew worked their stations with the calm efficiency that came from months of training and weeks of combat. But he could see the tension in their faces, the way their eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the gun flashes, watching for the next threat to emerge from the tropical night. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, but the Americans had superior radar and better damage control. The Japanese had the long lance torpedo, but the Americans had more ships. It would be a battle of technology against technique, numbers against know-how, with the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound serving as both battlefield and graveyard. As if to that grim thought, Tom saw a massive explosion light up the horizon to starboard. One of the ships, he couldn't tell if it was American or Japanese, had taken a catastrophic hit. The fireball rose several hundred feet into the air, painting the underside of the low-hanging clouds orange and red before fading back to the hellish twilight of battle. Damage report from Mount 3. Came a call from the damage control station. Direct hit on the gunhouse. Mount out of action. Casualties unknown. Tom felt Atlanta shudder as another enemy salvo straddled the ship, the waterspouts rising on both sides like liquid mountains. They were taking hits, losing men, bleeding steel and fire into the warm Pacific night. But they were also giving as good as they got. He could see their tracer fire reaching out toward the enemy ships, see the orange blooms of their shells impacting on Japanese hulls. This was what they'd trained for during all those peacetime exercises, all those boring gunnery drills and damage control scenarios. But training could never replicate the chaos of actual combat, the way time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, the way your mind could focus with crystal clarity on small details while losing track of the bigger picture entirely. Tom found himself noticing strange things. The way the gun crews moved in perfect coordination despite the chaos around them, the smell of cordite and hot metal that filled the air, the way the stars overhead seemed dimmed by the muzzle flashes and searchlights. His training as a junior officer had taught him to observe, to report, to coordinate, but no training could have prepared him for the sheer sensory overload of a night naval battle. Another searchlight beam swept across them, and Tom instinctively ducked as more enemy shells screamed overhead. But even as he crouched behind the bridge windscreen, he couldn't help but marvel at the deadly beauty of it all. The way the tracers drew glowing lines across the darkness, the way the shell splashes created brief columns of phosphorescent water, the way the gun flashes illuminated the ships in stark relief against the tropical night. Beautiful, yes, but deadly beyond measure. And they were just getting started. Part 2. Dancing with death, the Japanese destroyer seemed to appear from nowhere, sliding out of a rain squall like a steel phantom materializing from the mist. Tom watched in fascination and horror as the enemy ship emerged less than 500 yards off Atlanta's port beam, so close they could see individual sailors moving on her deck. The destroyer was one of the newer Fubuki-class vessels, her sleek hull cutting through the water with predatory grace. Her guns were already trained on Atlanta, the long barrels tracking the American cruiser with mechanical precision. Surface contact. Port beam, 500 yards. The lookout's voice cracked with tension. She's got us dead to rights. But Captain Jenkins was already spinning the wheel of tactical decision. All port batteries, target that destroyer. Make ready with star shells. The night lit up like the 4th of July as Atlanta's port-side 5-inch mounts swung toward the threat. The first salvo erupted in a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ship. Tom watched the orange tracers reach out across the dark water, saw them impact against the destroyer's superstructure in a shower of sparks and flying metal. The Japanese ship shuddered under the impact but kept coming. Her forward gun mount flashed orange, and Tom found himself staring down the throat of an incoming 5-inch shell. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as he watched the projectile's flight, a brief orange streak growing larger with each heartbeat. The shell struck Atlanta just below the bridge, punching through the light armor plating with a sound like the world's largest bell being struck with a sledgehammer. The explosion that followed sent Tom tumbling across the bridge deck as smoke and flame erupted from somewhere below. The acrid smell of burning paint and hot metal filled his nostrils as he struggled back to his feet. Damage control to frame 60. Came the call over the ship's announcing system, but it was nearly drowned out by the roar of Atlanta's return fire. The light cruiser's anti-aircraft batteries were designed to put up a wall of steel against attacking aircraft, and they were proving devastatingly effective against surface targets at close range. Tom watched through the smoke and flames as their shells tore into the Japanese destroyer. The enemy ship's forward superstructure dissolved under the concentrated fire, her rangefinder and director disappearing in explosions of twisted metal. But the destroyer's crew kept fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they were already dead. Torpedo in the water, came another shout. Bearing 285 range decreasing. Tom spotted the phosphorescent wake immediately, a single long lance cutting through the dark water toward Atlanta's stern. The Japanese destroyer had gotten off one last shot before succumbing to the American fire, and now the deadly fish was racing toward them at 40 knots. Right full rudder. All ahead flank, Captain Jenkins ordered, and Tom felt the deck heel sharply as Atlanta threw herself into an emergency turn. The ship's screws bit deep into the water, churning up a wake of phosphorescent foam as she fought to avoid the torpedo's track. For a moment that lasted forever, Tom watched the white wake streak toward them. The long lance was the finest torpedo in the world, bigger, faster, and more powerful than anything the Americans had. At this range, there would be no second chances. Either they'd turn fast enough, or they'd join the growing collection of wrecks on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The torpedo passed 10 feet astern, its wake visible in the phosphorescent water as it continued on into the darkness beyond. Tom let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, but there was no time to celebrate. More enemy ships were closing in from all directions, and Atlanta was right in the middle of the killing ground. Multiple surface contacts bearing 040 came the report from the radar room. Range 2,000 yards and closing. Tom looked in that direction and felt his stomach drop. A line of Japanese heavy cruisers was emerging from the darkness, their pagoda masts silhouetted against the gun flashes from other parts of the battle. These weren't destroyers. These were the heavy hitters, ships that could trade punches with anything the Americans had brought to the dance. The lead cruiser opened fire with a salvo that seemed to light up half the horizon. 8-inch shells screamed overhead with their distinctive freight train roar before impacting in massive waterspouts around the American formation. Tom watched in fascination as one shell struck USS Portland just forward of Herbridge, the explosion visible even at this distance. But the Americans weren't going down without a fight. USS San Francisco, the formation flagship, was engaging what looked like a Japanese battleship at point-blank range her 9-inch guns firing as fast as the crews could load them. The heavy cruiser was taking a beating. Tom could see fires burning along her superstructure. But she was giving as good as she got. New contact, bearing 180, came another radar report. Large contact, possibly battleship class. Tom turned to look astern and felt his blood freeze. There, emerging from the darkness like some prehistoric monster rising from the depths, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Japanese battleship. Even in the chaotic light of the gun battle, he could make out her massive main battery turrets, the pagoda superstructure that marked her as one of the older Japanese capital ships. "That's got to be Kirishima," muttered Chief Petty Officer Martinez at the next station. 14-inch guns. "She could blow us clean out of the water with a single salvo." As if to prove his point, the battleship's forward turrets flashed orange, and Tom watched in horrified fascination as the massive shells arced through the darkness. They were aimed at San Francisco, not Atlanta, but the psychological effect was still overwhelming. Those shells could punch through a foot of armor plate. What would they do to Atlanta's thin cruiser armor? The salvo impacted around San Francisco in a forest of waterspouts, each one tall enough to hide a destroyer. But the flagship kept fighting, her guns still flashing as she poured fire into the Japanese formation. It was like watching David take on Goliath, except David was already bleeding from a dozen wounds and Goliath had brought his entire family to the fight. "Sir, we're getting calls for star shell illumination from the formation," reported the communications officer. "Admiral Scott wants us to light up the Japanese line." Tom nodded grimly. Atlanta was equipped with special star shells designed to illuminate enemy formations during night actions. It was a dangerous mission. Lighting star shells would make them a target for every enemy gun in range. But it was what light cruisers were designed to do. "All batteries, load star shell," Captain Jenkins ordered. "We're going to light up this dance floor." The first star shell erupted overhead like a miniature sun, casting everything in harsh white light. Suddenly, the entire tactical situation was laid bare. Japanese ships to the north, south, and east, American vessels scattered throughout the formation, smoke and fire marking the positions of ships that had already taken serious damage. But the illumination came at a price. Every Japanese gun in range immediately swung toward Atlanta, and the incoming fire increased dramatically. Tom watched shells splash all around them, some so close that the waterspouts drenched the deck, others passing overhead with that distinctive crack whoosh sound that meant they'd missed by feet rather than yards. "Direct hit on Mount 2, came a damage control report. "Mount out of action, casualties heavy." Tom could see the smoke pouring from the destroyed gun mount, could smell the acrid stench of burning powder and hot metal. But Atlanta kept fighting, her remaining guns still firing as fast as the crews could load them. The ship was hurt, but she wasn't finished yet. Around them, the battle had dissolved into a dozen separate engagements. Tom could see USS Monson engaged in a point-blank duel with a Japanese destroyer, the two ships so close their gun flashes illuminated each other's superstructures. Further out, Portland was trading salvos with a heavy cruiser, her 9-inch guns leaving orange trails across the darkness. But it was the engagement between San Francisco and the Japanese battleship that held Tom's attention. The flagship was clearly outgunned, her 8-inch batteries no match for Kirishima's 14-inch rifles, but she was fighting with the desperate courage of a ship that knew retreat meant death. Her guns fired in a steady rhythm, the orange flashes strobing across the water like a deadly lighthouse. "Sir, San Francisco's taken a bad hit," reported the signal officer, lowering his binoculars. "Looks like her bridge is gone." Tom raised his own glasses and felt his heart sink. The flagship's superstructure was a mass of twisted metal and flame, her fire control systems clearly knocked out. But other guns were still firing, which meant someone was still alive down there. Still fighting even as the ship took hit after hit from Japanese shells. "Multiple torpedo wakes in the water," came another lookout report. "Bearing 090. Spread of 4. Range 1,000 yards. Tom spotted them immediately. 4 more long lances racing toward the American formation like underwater bullets. These weren't aimed at Atlanta, but at the formation as a whole. In the harsh light of the star shells, the phosphorescent wakes were clearly visible as they cut through the dark water. One of the torpedoes found its mark. USS Cushing, one of the destroyers screening the formation, took a long lance amidships and simply ceased to exist. The explosion was so violent that it broke the destroyer in half, both pieces disappearing beneath the waves in a matter of seconds. Tom watched men leap from the sinking hull, their life jackets glowing white in the star shell illumination as they hit the oil-covered water. Whispered Seaman Rodriguez. They got Cushing, but there was no time to mourn the lost destroyer. More Japanese ships kept appearing from the darkness, and the tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The Americans had been caught in what the Japanese called a night encounter battle, a close-range slugfest where superior numbers and firepower could overcome technological advantages. Tom checked his watch and was stunned to realize the entire engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes. It felt like hours, but the chaos of combat compressed time in strange ways. 20 minutes of the most intense naval action he'd ever experienced, and they were just getting started. Atlanta shuddered as another near miss sent a column of water cascading across her deck. Tom wiped the spray from his eyes and looked out at the tactical display spread across Iron Bottom Sound. Ships burning, ships sinking, ships still fighting with the desperate intensity of men who knew this night would determine the fate of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese had come south with a powerful force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers loaded with reinforcements and supplies for their troops on the island. The Americans had intercepted them with a smaller but more modern force, hoping to use radar and superior training to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. But now, as Tom watched San Francisco trade salvos with Kirishima at point-blank range, he realized this wouldn't be a battle won by technology or training. This would be a knife fight in a phone booth, decided by courage, luck, and the willingness to die before surrendering the sound to the enemy. The next star shell burst overhead, and Tom saw something that made his blood run cold. More Japanese ships were approaching from the north, a second force of heavy cruisers that had apparently been waiting for just this moment. The Americans were about to be caught in a pincer movement, attacked from multiple directions by superior forces. But even as the tactical situation deteriorated, Tom felt a strange sense of pride. These ships, these men, were writing their names in history with blood and fire. Whatever happened tonight, the Japanese would know they'd been in a fight. The dancing had just begun, and everyone on the floor was bleeding. Part 3. Iron Rain, the second Japanese force, hit them like a sledgehammer to the skull. Tom watched in stunned disbelief as 4 more heavy cruisers materialized from the northern darkness, their guns already trained on the scattered American formation. These weren't the older ships they'd been fighting. These were modern cruisers with the latest fire control systems, and they'd been waiting for precisely this moment to join the battle, muttered Chief Martinez, lowering his binoculars. Where the hell did those come from? The answer came in the form of 8-inch shells, screaming across Iron Bottom Sound like horizontal lightning. The lead Japanese cruiser opened fire with all guns, and Tom watched the orange tracers reach out toward USS Portland like the fingers of death itself. The American heavy cruiser was already engaged with another enemy ship and couldn't maneuver to avoid the new threat. The salvo struck Portland amidships with devastating effect. The 8-inch shells punched through her armor like it was paper, exploding deep inside the ship with flashes that lit up her hull from within. Tom could see secondary explosions as something vital, ammunition, fuel, or machinery, caught fire and spread that destruction throughout the cruiser's interior. Portland's been hit bad, reported the signal officer. She's listing to port and slowing. But even as Portland staggered under the enemy fire, her guns kept shooting. The heavy cruiser's 9-inch batteries continued their deadly work, pouring shells into the Japanese formation with the methodical precision of a machine. It was exactly the kind of performance Tom had expected from the Navy's peacetime training, professionals doing their job even as their ship died around them. New contact bearing 270. Came another radar report. Multiple destroyers, range 1,500 yards and closing fast. Tom swung his glasses in that direction and felt his stomach drop. A line of Japanese destroyers was racing toward them at flank speed, their hulls cutting through the water like knives. These weren't the older ships they'd been fighting. These were the newest Kagero-class destroyers, fast and heavily armed with the deadly long-lance torpedoes. "They're setting up for a torpedo attack," observed Captain Jenkins grimly. "All batteries, target those destroyers. We need to break up their formation before they can launch." Atlanta's remaining guns swung toward the new threat, and the night erupted in fire once again. The light cruiser's 5-inch batteries had been designed to destroy aircraft, but they were proving devastatingly effective against surface targets at close range. Tom watched their shells tear into the leading destroyer, saw the enemy ship's forward superstructure disintegrate under the concentrated fire. But the Japanese destroyers kept coming. They were professionals too, men who trained for this moment just as hard as the Americans had. Even as their lead ship staggered under Atlanta's fire, the others closed to torpedo launch range with the kind of tactical coordination that spoke of years off training. "Torpedo wakes in the water," came the inevitable cry. Multiple contacts. Bearing 270, spread of 12. 12 long-lance torpedoes, enough to sink half the American formation if they found their targets. Tom watched the phosphorescent wakes streak across the dark water like underwater meteors, each one carrying nearly 1,000 pounds of high explosive. At 40 knots, they covered the distance between ships in less than a minute. All ahead emergency. Left full rudder. Captain Jenkins ordered, and Atlanta threw herself into another desperate evasive maneuver. But 12 torpedoes created a spread pattern that was almost impossible to avoid completely. All they could do was try to minimize their profile and pray the enemy hadn't calculated their course correctly. The first torpedo passed just under Atlanta's stern, so close Tom could see the bubble wake through the clear tropical water. The second missed by 20 yards. The third. The explosion lifted the entire stern of USS Aaron Ward out of the water. The destroyer, which had been screening Atlanta's starboard beam, took a long lance amidships and simply folded like a broken toy. The blast was so violent that it sent debris flying hundreds of yards in every direction, including several pieces that clanged against Atlanta's hull. Tom watched in horror as Aaron Ward settled by the stern, her bow pointing skyward at an impossible angle. Men were jumping from her tilting deck, their life jackets white dots in the phosphorescent water. But there was no time to stop for survivors. The battle was still raging, and stopping meant dying. "Direct hit on Aaron Ward," reported the lookout unnecessarily. "She's going down fast." The destroyer disappeared beneath the waves less than 2 minutes after being hit, taking most of her crew with her. In the harsh light of the star shells, Tom could see the oil slick spreading across the water, along with the scattered debris that marked another ship's grave in Iron Bottom Sound. But the Japanese weren't finished yet. Even as Aaron Ward sank, more enemy destroyers were closing from the east, and the heavy cruisers that had started this latest phase of the battle were still pounding the American formation with methodical precision. "San Francisco's in trouble," observed the communications officer, listening to the radio chatter from other ships. "She's taken multiple hits and lost communications with the flagship." Tom raised his binoculars and studied the American flagship through the smoke and fire. San Francisco was clearly hurt. Her superstructure was a mass of twisted metal and flame, but her guns were still firing. The heavy cruiser was engaged in a point-blank duel with what looked like a Japanese battleship, trading punches like two heavyweight fighters in the final round. It was Kirishima, the old Japanese battleship that had been modernized before the war. Her 14-inch guns could have blown San Francisco out of the water with a single well-placed salvo, but the American cruiser's superior fire control was keeping her in the fight. Every time the battleship fired, San Francisco's guns replied with mathematical precision, walking their shells up and down the enemy ship's hull. "Sir, we're getting reports of more Japanese ships approaching from the south," reported the radar operator. "Looks like cruisers and destroyers, range unknown." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tropical night air. The Japanese weren't just trying to break through to Guadalcanal. They were trying to destroy the entire American force. This was turning into the kind of decisive naval battle that could determine the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. Atlanta shuddered as another enemy salvo straddled the ship, the waterspouts rizzing on both sides like liquid mountains. Tom could feel the deck plates vibrating under his feet, could smell the acrid smoke from their own guns mixing with the cordite haze that hung over the entire battle area. Mount 4 reports a misfire. Came a damage control report. They're working to clear the obstruction. Tom nodded, filing the information away automatically. After months of combat, his mind had learned to process multiple streams of information simultaneously: damage reports, tactical updates, enemy movements, friendly positions. It was like playing three-dimensional chess while someone shot at you with a machine gun. Another star shell burst overhead, and Tom got a clear view of the tactical situation. It was worse than he'd thought. The American formation had been scattered by the Japanese attacks, individual ships fighting separate engagements across several square miles of ocean. USS Laffey was engaged with 2 Japanese destroyers simultaneously, her guns firing so rapidly they seemed to strobe. Portland was still trading shots with the heavy cruisers despite her obvious damage. And throughout it all, San Francisco continued her desperate duel with Kirishima. "Sir, I'm picking up a transmission from Admiral Scott," reported the communications officer. "He's ordering all ships to withdraw to the southeast." Tom felt a moment of relief. At least someone was still alive in the flagship's combat information center to give tactical orders. But even as the withdrawal order went out, he could see it would be easier said than done. The Japanese had positioned themselves to block most of the escape routes, and any ship that tried to run would have to fight its way clear. "Signal all batteries to prepare for covering fire," Captain Jenkins ordered. "We'll lay down a barrage to cover the formation's withdrawal." Atlanta was designed for exactly this kind of mission, using her rapid-firing guns to lay down suppressive fire while other ships maneuvered. But it would make her a target for every Japanese gun in range, and her light cruiser armor couldn't take the kind of punishment the heavy ships could absorb. "Multiple torpedo wakes bearing 090, came another lookout report, spread of 6. Range 800 yards. Tom spotted them immediately, 6 more long lances cutting through the water toward the American formation. These were aimed at the heavy ships, probably San Francisco and Portland, but the spread pattern meant some might find other targets. One of the torpedoes found USS Cushing, or what was left of her. The destroyer had already been badly damaged earlier in the battle, but the long lance finished the job. The explosion broke her back, and she rolled over and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. "That's Cushing," reported the lookout unnecessarily. "She's gone. 2 destroyers down, along with God knew how many casualties among the other ships." Tom tried not to think about the mathematics of attrition, how many ships they could afford to lose before the formation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But the numbers weren't encouraging. Atlanta fired another star shell, and the harsh white light revealed more Japanese ships closing in from multiple directions. Tom counted at least 8 enemy vessels still in fighting condition, compared to maybe 6 American ships that could still maneuver and fight effectively. The odds were getting worse by the minute, but even as the tactical situation deteriorated, Tom felt a strange sense of pride in what he was witnessing. These ships and their crews were writing themselves into naval history with blood and gunpowder. Whatever the outcome, the Japanese would remember this night for the rest of the war. A massive explosion lit up the northern horizon, and Tom turned to see one of the Japanese cruisers stagger under what looked like a direct hit from San Francisco's main battery. The enemy ship was clearly hurt. He could see fires burning along her superstructure. But she was still fighting, still dangerous. "Sir, damage control reports fires on the main deck," came another report. "They're working to contain the spread." Tom nodded, adding that information to his mental picture of Atlanta's condition. They'd taken several hits, lost 2 gun mounts, and had fires burning in at least 3 locations. But the ship was still fighting, her remaining guns still reaching out toward the enemy with deadly precision. The iron rain continued to fall across Iron Bottom Sound, each drop a high explosive shell that could end a ship or a life in an instant. But the Americans weren't going down without a fight, and the Japanese were learning that breaking through to Guadalcanal would cost them dearly. The night was still young, and there was more dying yet to be done. Part 4. The price of steel. The end came not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the slow accumulation of damage that turned fighting ships into floating scrap heaps. Tom watched USS Atlanta die by degrees as the battle entered its bloodiest phase. Another Japanese salvo straddled the ship, And this time one of the 8-inch shells found its mark, punching through the light armor plating just after the bridge. The explosion sent a geyser of flame and twisted metal skyward, along with something that Tom's mind refused to identify as human remains. Direct hit on frame 90. Came the damage control report. Fire in the forward engine room. Main power fluctuating. The lights on the bridge flickered as Atlanta's electrical system struggled to cope with the damage. In the intermittent illumination, Tom could see Captain Jenkins still calmly giving orders, his uniform torn and bloody, but his voice steady as granite. Around him, the bridge crew continued their work with the professional detachment that came from months of combat training. But Tom could see the truth in their eyes. Atlanta was dying. The light cruiser had taken at least 6 direct hits, possibly more. 2 of her main gun mounts were out of action. Fires were burning in 3 separate compartments, and her speed was dropping as the engineering crew struggled to keep the damaged turbines online. She was still fighting. Her remaining guns continued to pour fire into the Japanese formation. Each salvo came slower than the last. "Sir, radar reports multiple contacts closing from the northwest," reported the CIC officer. "Looks like more Japanese destroyers, range 2,000 yards. Tom raised his binoculars and spotted them immediately. 4 more enemy destroyers racing toward the scattered American formation at flank speed. Their hulls cut through the phosphorescent water like knives, and he could see the white foam of their bow waves in the light from the star shells. Fresh enemies, with full ammunition loads and undamaged torpedo tubes. Tom felt his heart sink as he realized what this meant. The Americans had been fighting for over an hour now, expending ammunition and absorbing damage while the Japanese kept feeding fresh ships into the battle. It was a war of attrition they couldn't win. All remaining batteries. "Target those destroyers," Captain Jenkins ordered. "We need to keep them from getting into torpedo range." Atlanta's 3 functioning gun mounts swung toward the new threat, but their rate of fire had slowed dramatically. The ship's fire control systems were damaged, forcing the gun crews to rely on local control and manual tracking. It was like trying to fight a precision battle with a broken sword. The Japanese destroyers split into 2 groups as they closed, one pair heading for San Francisco while the other targeted Portland. Both American heavy cruisers were already damaged and engaged with other enemy ships. They wouldn't be able to maneuver effectively to avoid the torpedo attack. "Torpedo wakes in the water," came the cry Tom had been dreading. Multiple spreads, targeting the heavy units. He counted at least 8 phosphorescent trails streaking through the dark water toward the American cruisers. The long lance torpedoes moved at 40 knots, giving their targets less than 2 minutes to react. Tom watched San Francisco attempt a hard turn to port, but the flagship was already listing from previous damage and couldn't maneuver quickly enough. 2 torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser almost simultaneously, the explosions lifting her entire forward section out of the water before dropping it back with a tremendous crash. Tom could see the massive holes torn in her hull, could see the ocean rushing in through wounds that no damage control team could possibly plug. But San Francisco kept fighting. Even as she settled by the bow, her after turrets continued to fire at the Japanese battleship Kirishima. It was the kind of courage that naval legends were built on, men dying at their guns rather than surrender the sea to the enemy. Portland fared little better. A single long lance struck her just forward of the after turret, the explosion so violent it jammed her rudder hard to starboard. The heavy cruiser began steaming in a wide circle, unable to steer but still firing her main battery with deadly precision. Tom watched her 9-inch shells reach out across the water to smash into a Japanese cruiser, saw the enemy ship stagger under the impact. "Portland's going in circles, but she's still shooting," observed Chief Martinez with something approaching admiration. "Those boys don't know when to quit." The comment might have been funny under other circumstances, but Tom found no humor in watching American ships die. Each vessel represented hundreds of trained sailors, months of construction, and millions of dollars in taxpayer money. More importantly, each ship was somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father who wouldn't be coming home from this war. Atlanta shuddered as another enemy salvo bracketed the ship, the near misses close enough to drench the bridge with seawater. Tom wiped the spray from his eyes and then checked his watch, amazed to discover the battle had been raging for over 90 minutes. It felt both like forever and like no time at all. Combat had a way of distorting temporal perception until minutes stretched into hours and hours compressed into heartbeats. "Sir, engineering reports they can't maintain current speed much longer," came another damage report. "Number 2 boiler is offline, and number 1 is operating at reduced capacity." Captain Jenkins nodded grimly. "Very well. Signal the formation that we're reducing to 2/3 speed." But even as he gave the order, Tom knew it might be academic. Atlanta was hurt badly enough that she might not survive the night regardless of her speed. The question was whether she could keep fighting long enough to cover the other ship's withdrawal. Another star shell burst overhead, and Tom got a clear view of the tactical situation. It was even worse than he'd feared. Of the original American force, only 4 ships were still capable of effective action: Atlanta, Helena, Juno, and the battered Portland steaming her endless circles. San Francisco was clearly sinking, though her guns were still firing. 2 destroyers were already on the bottom, and the others had withdrawn or been crippled. Against them, the Japanese still had at least 6 ships in fighting condition: heavy cruisers, destroyers, and the battleship Kirishima that continued to dominate the northern part of the Sound with her 14-inch guns. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unforgiving. Multiple surface contacts bearing 040 came yet another radar report. Range 3,000 yards and closing. Tom turned his binoculars in that direction and felt his blood freeze. More Japanese ships were approaching from the northeast, what looked like a column of heavy cruisers that had been waiting for just this moment to join the slaughter. The enemy had held back a reserve force, and now they were committing it to finish off the American formation, whispered Seaman Rodriguez. How many ships did they bring to this dance? It was a good question. Intelligence had estimated the Japanese force at maybe 8 or 10 ships, but Tom had personally observed at least 15 different enemy vessels during the course of the battle. Either their intelligence had been wrong, or the Japanese had concentrated a much larger force than anyone had anticipated. Atlanta's guns fired another salvo, but Tom could tell the ship's effectiveness was declining rapidly. The rate of fire had dropped to less than half what it had been at the start of the engagement, and several of the shells were clearly missing their targets. Battle damage was taking its toll on both men and machinery. "Sir, we're getting a transmission from Admiral Scott," reported the communications officer. "He's ordering all ships to make smoke and withdraw to the southeast." Tom felt a mixture of relief and shame. Relief that they might survive the night. Shame that they were abandoning the field to the enemy. But tactical reality was harsh. Staying meant dying, and dead ships couldn't protect Guadalcanal. "All ahead 2/3. Come to course 140, Captain Jenkins ordered. "Make smoke and prepare to cover the formation's withdrawal." Atlanta began laying down a thick smoke screen as she turned toward the southeast, her remaining guns still firing at any Japanese target that presented itself. Around her, the other surviving American ships began their own withdrawal, each one covering the others, as they fought their way clear of the trap that Iron Bottom Sound had become. But the Japanese weren't going to let them go easily. The fresh enemy cruisers opened fire as soon as the American ships began their withdrawal, their 8-inch salvos reaching out across the dark water like grasping fingers. Tom watched the orange tracers streak past Atlanta's stern, saw them splash into the water just yards away. "They're trying to cut us off," observed Captain Jenkins. "Signal Helena to increase speed and take the lead. We'll cover her withdrawal." It was exactly the kind of sacrifice play that light cruisers were designed for, using their speed and firepower to screen the heavier units while they escaped. But Atlanta was no longer fast, and her firepower was seriously degraded. Tom wondered if they could maintain an effective covering action long enough for the other ships to get clear. The answer came in the form of a Japanese salvo that found its mark with devastating precision. 3 8-inch shells struck Atlanta almost simultaneously, one on the forward superstructure, one amidships, and one near the stern. The explosions came so close together they seemed like a single massive blast that lifted the entire ship out of the water. Tom found himself on the deck, his ears ringing and his vision blurred by smoke and flame. Around him, the bridge was a scene of devastation, twisted metal, sparking electrical equipment, and the still forms of men who would never see another sunrise. Captain Jenkins was slumped over the helm, blood running down his face from a head wound that might or might not be fatal. Damage control to the bridge. Tom shouted into his sound-powered telephone, but got no response. The ship's internal communications had been severed, leaving him isolated from the rest of the crew. Atlanta was clearly dying now. Tom could feel her settling by the stern as seawater rushed in through the holes torn in her hull. Her remaining guns had fallen silent, and he could see fires burning in at least 6 different locations. The ship might stay afloat for another hour or two, but she would never fight again. But even as Atlanta began her death spiral, Tom could see that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Helena and Juno were pulling away from the Japanese force, their smokescreens providing cover as they headed for the relative safety of the southern approaches. Portland was still steaming her endless circles, but her guns continued to fire at any enemy ship that came within range. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the first of what would be several naval engagements in these waters, was winding down to its bloody conclusion. The Americans had prevented the Japanese from landing their reinforcements, but at a terrible cost in ships and lives. Iron Bottom Sound had earned its name with American as well as Japanese steel. Tom struggled to his feet and looked out at the carnage spread across the dark water. Ships burning, ships sinking, ships limping away trailing smoke and oil. The phosphorescent wake of torpedoes still visible in the tropical sea. The smell of cordite and burning fuel oil that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. This was what naval warfare looked like when the gloves came off, not the clean, antiseptic battles described in the Naval War College textbooks, but a brutal slugfest where courage and luck mattered as much as firepower and technology. Men and ships tested to the breaking point and beyond, with survival going to those who could endure the most punishment while still fighting back. Atlanta shuddered as another internal explosion shook her hull. Tom knew the ship had only minutes left, but he felt no urge to abandon his post. This was where he belonged, on the bridge of a fighting ship, doing his duty until the very end. The stars overhead seemed dimmed by the smoke and flames of battle, but they were still there, still watching over the men who fought and died in their light. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over Iron Bottom Sound, and the war would continue. But tonight belonged to the sailors who had written their names in history with blood and steel. Part V. Dawn of the Damned. The sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound like a crimson eye opening on carnage. Tom Hartwell floated in the oil-slicked water, his life jacket keeping him barely above the surface as he watched USS Atlanta's final moments. The light cruiser lay on her side, her hull torn open by multiple hits, seawater rushing through wounds no damage control team could possibly repair. She'd fought until her ammunition was exhausted and her guns were silenced, but even steel and courage had their limits. "There she goes," whispered Chief Martinez from somewhere nearby in the water. His voice carried the kind of reverence usually reserved for funerals, which Tom supposed this was. Atlanta rolled completely over with agonizing slowness, her keel pointing skyward for a moment before she slipped beneath the waves with a sound like the world's largest sigh. Tom felt something break inside his chest as he watched her disappear. Not just a ship, but a home, a community, a way of life vanishing forever into the depths of the Pacific. Around him in the water, survivors from multiple ships clung to debris and life rafts, their oil-blackened faces reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Some were wounded, their blood mixing with the fuel oil that covered the surface like a toxic blanket. Others were simply in shock, their minds struggling to process the violence that they'd witnessed and survived. "Anybody seen the skipper?" called out Ensign Morrison from a nearby life raft. The young officer's uniform was torn and bloody, but his voice still carried the authority of command. "Captain Jenkins went down with the ship," replied someone Tom couldn't see. "Saw him on the bridge when she rolled over." The news hit Tom harder than he'd expected. Captain Jenkins had been a good officer, calm under pressure, decisive in action, genuinely concerned about his crew's welfare. Now he was gone, along with most of Atlanta's crew. Tom tried not to think about the numbers, but his mind calculated automatically. Over 600 men on the ship's roster, maybe 200 in the water around him. The mathematics of naval warfare were brutal and unforgiving. A destroyer appeared on the horizon, her gray hull cutting through the morning swells as she approached the debris field. Tom felt a moment of panic. Was she American or Japanese? In the early morning light, it was impossible to tell friend from foe until she got closer. "That's Fletcher," called out Chief Martinez with relief. "She's coming to pick us up." The American destroyer slowed as she entered the debris field, her crew already manning boat falls and throwing Lenesto survivors in the water. Tom watched the rescue operations with professional interest, noting how efficiently the destroyer's crew worked to pull men from the oil-covered sea. They'd obviously done this before, a grim reminder that Atlanta wasn't the first ship to die in these waters. "Grab the cargo net," shouted a sailor from Fletcher's deck as the destroyer maneuvered alongside Tom's group of survivors. "We'll have you aboard in no time." Tom reached for the net with hands that shook from exhaustion and shock. The climb up Fletcher's hull seemed to take forever, each rung requiring more effort than the last. By the time he reached the deck, his arms felt like rubber and his legs could barely support his weight. "Easy there, sailor," said a hospitalman who helped Tom to a sitting position on the destroyer's deck. "You've had a rough night." "Rough night." Tom almost laughed at the understatement. He'd watched his ship die, seen friends and shipmates killed by enemy fire, floated in the Pacific for 6 hours wondering if rescue would come. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for the hundreds of men who'd gone down with their ships. As Fletcher continued her rescue operations, Tom got his first clear view of the tactical situation in daylight. The results were sobering. Scattered across Iron Bottom Sound were the debris fields of multiple ships, American and Japanese vessels that had fought and died during the night engagement. Oil slicks marked the grave sites, along with floating debris and the occasional survivor clinging to wreckage. Muttered one of the Fletcher crewmen. "Looks like a ship graveyard out here." That was exactly what it was. Tom could see at least 4 major debris fields, representing ships that had been sent to the bottom during the night's fighting. The water itself seemed changed, stained with oil and smoke, littered with the detritus of modern naval combat. But the Japanese hadn't gotten off lightly either. Through his binoculars, Tom could see smoke rising from what looked like a heavy cruiser limping toward the northwest. Another enemy ship, possibly a destroyer, appeared to be dead in the water about 5 miles away, her hull listing heavily to starboard. The Americans had given as good as they got, even in defeat. "Sir, we're picking up radio traffic from the other ships in the formation," reported Fletcher's communications officer to his captain. "Looks like Helena and Juno made it clear of the sound. Portland is still afloat but needs assistance." Tom felt a moment of relief. Some of the American ships had survived the night, which meant the sacrifice of Atlanta and her crew hadn't been completely in vain. The Japanese force had been badly mauled, even if they'd achieved a tactical victory. "What about the Japanese?" asked Fletcher's captain. "Any sign of their main force?" "Negative, sir. Looks like they've withdrawn to the north, but there are reports of enemy ships still in the area, stragglers and damaged vessels." Tom nodded grimly. The battle might be over, but the war would continue. Both sides had learned valuable lessons about night fighting, about the importance of radar and fire control, about the deadly effectiveness of the long-lance torpedo. These lessons would be written in blood and applied in future engagements. As the morning wore on, more details of the night's action became clear through radio reports and survivor accounts. The Americans had lost 2 destroyers sunk and multiple ships damaged, including the flagship San Francisco. But the Japanese had paid a heavy price as well. At least 1 heavy cruiser sunk, multiple ships damaged, and their planned reinforcement of Guadalcanal disrupted. Most importantly, Henderson Field was still in American hands. The airstrip that had been the focus of so much fighting remained operational, its Marine and Navy pilots ready to continue their attacks on Japanese shipping during daylight hours. The night belonged to the surface ships, but the day belonged to the aviators. "Sir, we've got all the survivors we can find," reported Fletcher's executive officer. "Request permission to withdraw toward Noumea." The destroyer captain nodded. "Very well. Set course 180, all ahead 2/3. Let's get these men to safety." As Fletcher turned away from Iron Bottom Sound, Tom took one last look at the scene of the night's battle. The water that had seemed so beautiful in peacetime now looked ominous and threatening, stained with oil and littered with debris. Ships had died here, men had died here, and the sound itself seemed changed by the violence it had witnessed. But there was also something else, a sense of pride that transcended the tactical defeat. American sailors had stood up to the best the Imperial Japanese Navy could throw at them, and had fought with courage and skill that would be remembered long after the last veteran had gone to his grave. They'd written their names in naval history with blood and gunpowder, and future generations would study their actions and learn from their sacrifice. Tom closed his eyes and tried to process what he'd experienced. The chaos and terror of the night action, the sound of shells screaming overhead, the sight of ships burning and sinking, the feel of salt water and oil as he floated among the debris of his dying ship. These memories would stay with him for the rest of his life, defining not just how he saw the war, but how he understood the nature of courage and sacrifice. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the first of several naval engagements that would rage in these waters over the coming months, was over. The Americans had lost the tactical engagement, but had achieved something more important. They'd proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the Imperial Japanese Navy and fight on equal terms. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. As Fletcher steamed toward safety, Tom thought about the men who wouldn't be making the return journey. Captain Jenkins, who'd died at his post on Atlanta's bridge. The gun crews who'd kept firing even as their ship sank beneath them. The damage control parties who'd fought fires and flooding right up to the end. They'd done their duty in the finest traditions of the naval service, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The sun climbed higher in the tropical sky, burning away the smoke and mist that had shrouded Iron Bottom Sound during the night battle. But the water itself remained changed, darker somehow, heavier with the weight of the ships and men it now held. This stretch of ocean had become a graveyard, a monument to the men who'd fought and died for control of a small island that most Americans had never heard of before the war began. But Tom knew that Guadalcanal was more than just another island. It was the place where America had decided to stop retreating and start fighting back. It was where young men from farms and factories and city neighborhoods had learned what it meant to face the enemy on equal terms and emerge victorious through courage and sacrifice. The war would continue for 3 more years, with battles even larger and more terrible than the one just concluded. But historians would mark this night as a turning point, the moment when the tide of war in the Pacific began to shift in America's favor. Not because of any single tactical victory, but because American sailors and Marines had proven they could match the enemy's skill and exceed his determination. As Fletcher disappeared over the horizon, Iron Bottom Sound settled into the kind of tropical calm that had characterized these waters before the war. But beneath the surface, the wrecks of great ships rested in the coral sand, their hulls serving as monuments to the men who'd sailed them into battle and died at their posts. The Sound would see more battles in the months to come, as both sides fed ships and men into the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign. But this first engagement had set the pattern, night actions at close range, decided by courage and luck as much as by firepower and technology. Tom Hartwell would survive the war and return to his home in Ohio, where he'd marry his high school sweetheart and raise 3 children who would grow up hearing stories about the night their father's ship died fighting the Japanese in a place called Iron Bottom Sound. But he would never forget the men who didn't come home, the sailors who'd written their names in history with blood and steel and had paid the ultimate price for freedom. Years later, when naval historians wrote about the Guadalcanal campaign, they would focus on the tactical details and strategic implications of the various engagements. But Tom would remember the human cost, the faces of men who'd stood their watches and done their duty even as their world came apart around them. That was the real story of Iron Bottom Sound. Not just ships and battles and tactical victories, but the courage of ordinary men who'd found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and had risen to meet the challenge with honor and sacrifice. They'd held the line when holding the line was all that stood between freedom and tyranny, and their example would inspire future generations of American sailors who would face their own tests in distant waters. The sun continued its climb toward noon, burning away the last traces of smoke from the night's battle. But the memory would linger, in the survivors' dreams, in the official reports, in the letters home to families who would never see their sons and husbands and fathers again. Iron Bottom Sound had earned its name in the crucible of combat, and the price had been paid in American blood and American steel. But the men who'd fought and died in these waters had accomplished something that would echo through history. They'd proven that freedom was worth any sacrifice, and that courage could triumph over any odds. The battle was over. The war would continue. And somewhere in the depths of Iron Bottom Sound, great ships rested in eternal silence, their hulls serving as monuments to the finest tradition of the United States Navy: duty, honor, country, and the willingness to sail into harm's way when freedom called.